China released 62 horses into one of the most hostile landscapes on Earth and then stepped back and watched. No supplemental feeding, no veterinary intervention beyond basic monitoring, no artificial water sources, no managed grazing rotation. Just horses and a vast, wind-scoured, nearly lifeless desert expanse in the far northwest of China that had not supported large wild herbivores for centuries. The scientists who designed the program expected struggle. They expected loss. They had built mortality projections into their models and prepared themselves for the reality that rewilding a desert with apex grazers was going to be a painful, slow, uncertain process with no guarantee of success. What they were not prepared for, what nobody in the international conservation community had predicted based on any existing ecological model, was what the horses actually did to that desert. Within a timeline so compressed it defied every projection, the landscape began to change. And the change was not subtle. It was not gradual. It was the kind of wholesale ecological transformation that scientists associate with processes unfolding over centuries, not years. The barren ground began to live again, and the mechanism behind that transformation revealed something about the relationship between large herbivores and arid landscapes that has rewritten foundational assumptions in ecology, conservation biology, and our understanding of how deserts are made and how they can be unmade. The location is the Kalameli Nature Reserve in Xinjiang, a vast protected area in the Dzungarian Basin of northwestern China. To call it inhospitable understates the case considerably. The Dzungarian Basin is a cold desert, a landscape defined by extremes that most living things cannot negotiate. Winter temperatures plunge to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Summer temperatures on the exposed ground surface can reach 70 degrees. Precipitation averages less than 150 millimeters per year, and in some years falls far below even that. The wind is relentless and carries with it fine particles of sand and dust that scour exposed surfaces and make the establishment of vegetation a constant battle against physical abrasion. The dominant plants are sparse, widely spaced, and adapted to a degree of aridity and temperature stress that would kill the vast majority of the world's plant species outright. This is not a landscape that forgives weakness. It is a landscape that has been filtering out everything that cannot survive its particular brand of brutality for millions of years. The horses released into this environment were Przewalski's horses, known in scientific literature as Equus ferus Przewalski, and to the Mongolian people as Taki, meaning spirit or worthy of worship. These are not feral domestic horses. They are not the descendants of escaped ranch animals gone wild. They are the last surviving truly wild horse species on Earth, a distinct evolutionary lineage that split from the ancestors of domestic horses approximately 550,000 years ago and has remained genetically separate ever since. Their chromosome count is different from domestic horses. Their behavior is different. Their physiology is different. They are, in every meaningful biological sense, a different animal from the horses that humans domesticated and have lived alongside for millennia. Przewalski's horses were declared extinct in the wild in 1969. The last confirmed wild sighting was in Mongolia, and the species survived into the modern era only because a small number of individuals had been captured in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and placed in European zoos. By the mid-20th century, the entire global population of Przewalski's horses consisted of fewer than 13 individuals held in captivity. The genetic bottleneck represented by that number is almost incomprehensibly severe. Every Przewalski's horse alive today, every single one of the 2,000 or so individuals that exist in captivity and in rewilded populations around the world, descends from that tiny founding group of fewer than 13 animals. The genetic diversity of the entire species was compressed through the eye of a needle so narrow that population geneticists who study the Przewalski's horse genome still marvel that the species survived it with enough functional genetic variation to sustain a viable population. The recovery program that brought Przewalski's horses back from that precipice is one of the most remarkable conservation success stories of the 20th century. Through coordinated international breeding programs managed across dozens of zoos and wildlife facilities, the population was slowly rebuilt. Reintroduction efforts began in Mongolia in the 1990s, returning horses to the Mongolian steppe from which the last wild individuals had vanished a generation earlier. Those reintroductions were successful enough to establish a small but growing wild population, and the Przewalski's horse was downlisted from extinct in the wild to critically endangered, and eventually to endangered, on the IUCN Red List. Each step forward was hard-won, carefully managed, and built on intensive ongoing intervention. China's program in the Kalameli Reserve represented a different and more radical approach. The Dzungarian Basin had historically been part of the Przewalski's horses range. The species had roamed this landscape for thousands of years before the combination of hunting pressure and habitat disruption eliminated them from the region in the late 19th and early 20th century. The horses belonged here, in an ecological sense that went beyond sentiment. They had been part of this landscape's functioning system for long enough to leave their mark on it. to be woven into its ecological relationships, to represent a missing component whose absence had contributed to the degradation of the habitat over the intervening century. The Chinese reintroduction program was built on the hypothesis that returning the horses to the Kalameli Reserve would not just restore a species to its former range, it would restore a functional relationship between a large herbivore and an arid landscape that had been broken for generations. What the scientists did not fully appreciate when they released those first 62 horses was the scale and speed at which that restoration would operate. The initial years of the program were consumed with the basic questions of survival. Could the horses find enough food in a landscape where vegetation was so sparse that the biomass per hectare was a fraction of what any standard ecological model would consider sufficient to support a herd? Could they access water in an environment where surface water was seasonal, unreliable, and in some areas completely absent? Could they survive the temperature extremes of Zungorian winters, which were harsh beyond what even the hardiest domestic horse breeds could reliably tolerate? The early data was cautious and mixed. Animals were lost. There were difficult winters. The herd's movements across the reserve were wide-ranging and energetically costly in ways that suggested the horses were working hard to extract sufficient nutrition from an environment that offered it only grudgingly. And then something began to happen that the monitoring data started recording before anyone fully understood what they were seeing. The vegetation around the areas where the horses spent the most time was changing, not declining, as the conventional model of heavy grazing pressure on a fragile arid ecosystem would predict, changing in the other direction, growing denser, diversifying, spreading into areas that had previously been bare or nearly bare ground. The horses were grazing, certainly, consuming plant material at a significant rate. But the net effect of their presence on the vegetation was not depletion, it was stimulation. The mechanism that explains this apparent paradox is one of the most important concepts in modern ecology, and one that has been chronically underappreciated in conservation practice for decades. It is the concept of what ecologists call the grazing optimization hypothesis, and its implications for how we understand the relationship between herbivores and grassland or steppe ecosystems are profound. The core insight is that grasses and other grazing adapted plants did not simply evolve to tolerate grazing. They evolved in the presence of grazing. They evolved with grazers. They are, at a physiological level, dependent on grazing for optimal function in ways that are deeply counterintuitive to human intuitions about plants and their relationship to animals that eat them. When a grass plant is grazed, the removal of the above-ground leaf material triggers a cascade of physiological responses. Root architecture changes to redirect energy allocation toward new shoot production. Tillering, the production of new side shoots from the base of the plant, accelerates. The plant's overall growth rate increases in response to the stimulus of defoliation. Grazed grass plants, managed at the right intensity and frequency, are not weakened by grazing. They are stimulated by it. They grow more vigorously, spread more aggressively, and accumulate more total biomass over time than ungrazed plants of the same species growing in the same conditions. This is why the world's great grasslands, the African savanna, the North American prairie, the Eurasian steppe, all evolved and were maintained in the presence of enormous herds of large herbivores. Remove the grazers, and the grassland does not simply persist unchanged. It begins to degrade. The grass plants that evolved for a world with grazers perform poorly in a world without them. The Kalameli Reserve had been without large native grazers for generations when the Przewalski's horses were returned. The sparse vegetation present when the horses arrived was the vegetation of an ungrazed ecosystem, poorly stimulated, growing below its potential productivity in the very specific biological sense that the absence of the grazing stimulus it had evolved to require had left it underperforming. The horses did not devastate that vegetation, they woke it up. The physical effects of the horses on the landscape extended far beyond the direct physiological stimulus of grazing. Hooves are powerful tools of soil disturbance, and in an arid landscape, soil disturbance of the right kind matters enormously. The surface of a desert soil that has not been disturbed for extended periods develops a physical crust, a layer of compacted fine particles, cryptobiotic organisms, and wind-deposited material that dramatically reduces the infiltration of the rare rainfall events that do occur. Water falling on a crusted desert soil runs off rather than soaking in, evaporates quickly from the surface rather than penetrating to the depths where plant roots can access it, and carries away fine soil particles that represent the most nutrient-rich component of the substrate. Desert soils are already nutrient poor. Runoff from crusted surfaces makes them progressively poorer over time in a slow feedback loop that ratchets the landscape toward greater and greater aridity. Horse hooves break that crust. The physical impact of hundreds of hooves moving across the desert surface thousands of times a day creates a constantly disturbed mosaic of broken crust and loosened soil that behaves completely differently when rain falls on it. Water infiltrates. It penetrates to depth. It is held in the soil column rather than evaporating from the surface. And in that retained moisture, Plant seeds that might have germinated briefly and then died in the previous surface conditions have a window to establish. The horses were not just grazing the existing vegetation. They were, through the simple physical act of walking, creating the soil conditions that allowed new vegetation to establish in areas that had been bare ground for years or decades. Their dung added the third element of the transformation. A horse produces significant quantities of manure every day, and that manure is a complex biological package containing partially digested plant material, gut microbiota, fungi, seeds, and nutrients in a form that soil organisms can immediately access. Deposited across the landscape in the course of normal movement, horse dung functions as a distributed nutrient injection system, returning to the soil the mineral content extracted by grazing in a concentrated, biologically active form that stimulates the soil microbial community in exactly the way that arid soils, which are typically microbially impoverished, most need. The dung also contains viable seeds of every plant species the horses have consumed, deposited in a package of nutrient-rich material that gives those seeds optimal germination conditions. The horses were eating the sparse existing vegetation and then replanting it, in improved soil conditions, across the full extent of their ranging territory. The cumulative effect of all of these mechanisms operating simultaneously was a pace of vegetation recovery that the monitoring teams found difficult to credit when they first began documenting it. Areas that had been functionally bare ground began showing measurable plant cover within 2 growing seasons of regular horse use. Species diversity in grazed areas increased compared to ungrazed control zones in the reserve. Soil moisture measurements in areas of regular horse activity showed significantly higher retention than equivalent areas without horse presence. The landscape was responding to the return of its missing component with a speed and vigor that the scientific models had not predicted. But the transformation did not stop at vegetation and soil. Because when plants come back, everything that depends on plants follows. Insects return to the recovering vegetation zones, and in numbers and diversity, that monitoring teams had not recorded in the reserve for years. Small mammals, whose populations had been declining in the absence of sufficient vegetative cover, began recovering in zones where the horses had stimulated plant growth. And then the predators began to notice. Wolves, already present in the Kalamili Reserve in small numbers, began spending more time in the areas where the horse-driven vegetation recovery was pulling in prey species. The trophic cascade that ecologists understand in theory but rarely get to watch unfold in real time was playing out across the desert landscape of the Dzungarian Basin, triggered by 62 horses and the chain of ecological consequences their presence set in motion. The scientific community's response to the documented rate of change in the Kalamili Reserve has been a mixture of excitement and genuine recalibration. The data coming out of the monitoring program does not fit the standard models for ecosystem recovery in arid environments. Those models predict slow, fragile, easily reversed change operating on timescales of decades. What the Przewalski's horses produced in Kalamili operated on timescales of years, was robust against the extreme climatic variation of the Dzungarian Basin, and showed every indication of being self-reinforcing rather than dependent on continued intensive management. The implications extend far beyond one nature reserve in northwestern China. Arid and semi-arid lands cover approximately 40% of the Earth's land surface. Desertification, the process by which previously productive land loses vegetation cover and transitions toward desert conditions, affects more than 100 countries and threatens the livelihoods of over 1 billion people worldwide. The conventional response to desertification has focused on reducing pressure on degraded land, fencing it off, eliminating grazing, allowing it to recover in the absence of the disturbance that was blamed for its degradation. The Kalamili data suggests that this approach, applied without nuance to landscapes that evolved with large herbivores, may in some cases be making the problem worse rather than better. Removing all grazing from a landscape that evolved with grazing does not restore it. It removes the stimulus it evolved to require. The horses of Kalamili did not know they were conducting an ecological experiment. They did not know that the scientists watching them were revising their understanding of how arid ecosystems function. They were doing what Przewalski's horses have been doing for hundreds of thousands of years, moving across a landscape, grazing, disturbing soil, depositing seeds and nutrients, and in doing so, maintaining the conditions that allow that landscape to support life. They had been doing it here, in the specific desert, long before they were gone. And when they came back, the desert remembered. 62 horses walked into a barren landscape and the land woke up. That is not a metaphor. That is what the data shows. And what it tells us about the relationship between animals and the landscapes they evolved within is something that conservation science, land management policy, and our entire framework for thinking about what a healthy ecosystem requires will be grappling with for a very long time. The desert was not dead. It was waiting. It was waiting for the sound of hooves,